Welcome back to another episode of Smooth Brain EDH, where we make the smoothest plays with the biggest brains. New Capenna is finally here, and the Smooth Brain crew was super excited to brew around some of these awesome new commanders. So let's see what they brought to the table. First up is Cameron on Jaxis, the Troublemaker. This is a mono red deck focused around copying impactful creatures and swinging at opponents for loads of damage. He keeps a hand with 2 mountains, War Room, Soul Ring, Sneak Attack, Professional Facebreaker, and Deflecting Swat. Next up is Chandler on Ziatora, the Incinerator. This deck cares about big mana and big creatures, using Ziatora to fling big creatures at his opponents while gaining treasures. He starts the game with Prismatic Vista, Verdant Catacombs, Visager Who Endures, Rampant Growth, Nature's Lure, Professional Facebreaker, and Galta Primal Hunger. Third is Shelby on Mari, the Killing Quill. This mono-black deck hopes to control the board, killing opponent's creatures to help take advantage of Mari's ability to draw cards and make treasures. His opening hand contains 3 Swamps, Fellwar Stone, Prowler's Helm, Sanguine Spy, and Exsanguinate. Our last player today is Sam on Ognis the Dragon Slash. This deck plans to generate plenty of treasures with Ognis' ability by playing a bunch of hasty dudes that swing at opponents. He keeps Command Tower, Overgrown Tomb, Prismatic Vista, Golgari Signet, Ginger Brute, Max the Daredevil, and Cavalier of Flame. We're about to hop right into the game, but before that, go ahead and give us a like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of our new content. We post new gameplay videos every week and new episodes of our podcast every other week, so you won't want to miss it. Links to the deck lists, our social media, and our public Discord server are in the description. Our channel is also partnered with Dragon Shield, so if you're looking to pick up any new sleeves or match-related products, check out our affiliate link in the description. Now, on to the gameplay.
Shelby wins the die roll, and he'll play a swamp and pass to Sam. Sam will play a command tower and tap for 1, casting a Ginger Brute. He'll then swing it at Shelby and then pass the turn to Cameron, who plays a mountain and gets the fabled turn 1 Soul Ring. He'll then tap that Soul Ring to cast the Sundial of the Infinite and then pass the turn to Chandler. Chandler will play a Verdant Catacombs as land for turn and immediately fetch with it. He declares he's going to get a Ziatora's Proving Ground and passes the turn while searching. Now on Shelby's turn, he'll play a swamp as land for turn, then tap for 2 and cast a Fellwar Stone and then pass the turn to Sam, who shocks in an Overgrown Tomb as land for turn, then taps for 2 and casts a Golgari Signet. After this, he moves to combat and swings for 1 at the Soul Ring player, understandably, and then passes the turn. Now on Cameron's turn, he'll start off with a basic mountain as land for turn. He'll then cast his commander, Jaxis, and then pass the turn to Chandler. Chandler plays a swamp as land for turn, then taps for 2 to cast a Rampant Growth. He finds a forest to the battlefield tapped, and passes while he's searching. Now on his turn, Shelby plays a swamp. He'll then pay 3 to Megamorph of Solemgar's Assassin face down. The turn is then passed to Sam, who plays a mountain as land for turn, then taps for 4 to cast his commander, Ognis the Dragon Slash. He'll then move to combat and swing Ginger Brute at Chandler and Ognis at Cameron. After declaring attacks, Sam will make 2 treasure tokens that are tapped, and then everyone takes their damage. The turn is then passed to Cameron, who immediately taps for 3 and casts a Professional Facebreaker. He'll then activate Jaxis by tapping her, paying a red, and discarding a Wasteland to make a token of the Facebreaker. Creatures made by Jaxis have Blitz, meaning they have haste, and when they die, Cameron will get to draw a card. He'll then move to combat and swing the copy at Sam, and when it connects, he gets 2 Facebreaker triggers, making 2 treasure tokens. He then plays a War Room as land for turn, then passes the turn to Chandler, and on his end step, his Facebreaker copy will die, and he draws a card. Continuing on, Chandler will start his turn off with a Prismatic Vista. He'll then tap for 2 to cast a Nature's Lure, hold priority, and crack his Prismatic Vista so he can get both instances of searching out the way, and everybody lets those resolve. He gets a Bayou from the Nature's Lure, and a Mountain from the Prismatic Vista. After this, he'll cast his own Professional Facebreaker and then pass the turn to Shelby, who starts off by tapping for 3 to cast his commander, Mary. He'll then move to combat and swing for 2 at Sam, who takes it, and then Shelby will pass the turn. Sam will start his turn off by playing a Bloodstained Mire and immediately cracking it for a Taiga. He'll then tap for 3 mana and cast a Max the Daredevil. After this, he moves to combat and swings Max and Ginger Brute at Cameron, paying the 1 to Ginger Brute to make it unblockable. Sam will make 2 tapped treasures and Cameron will take 4 damage. The turn is then passed to Cameron, who will start off with a Sneak Attack, and then pays a red to it to activate the Sneak Attack, putting a duplicate into play. When it enters the battlefield, he decides to exile the Max. After this, he'll activate Jaxis by sacrificing a treasure, discarding a Forgotten Cave, and choosing Professional Facebreaker as the target. So he now has 2 Facebreakers and he moves to combat. He'll swing Duplicate at Shelby, and 1 of each Facebreakers at Chandler and Sam. Chandler and Sam can't block, and Shelby chooses not to, and since Cameron attacked 3 different players, Each of the face breakers will trigger 3 times, making him a total of 6 treasures. He'll then sacrifice one of the treasures to one of his face breakers to exile an Illusionist Bracers off the top of his library. He'll then repeat this process, exiling Perforos the Bronze-Blooded. He'll then do it again, exiling a Mindclaw Shaman. After this, he'll sacrifice 2 treasures to cast the Illusionist Bracers from exile. He'll then move to end step and sacrifice his 2 creatures. He draws a card when the copy dies, and the duplicate is exiled with a hit counter on it. And so the turn will be passed to Chandler. And he'll immediately move to combat and swing his Facebreaker at Cameron. When it connects, Chandler makes a treasure token. Now in his second main, Chandler will tap for 4 and cast a Goreclaw. He'll then play a tapped Overgrown Tomb as land for turn, and then pass the turn to Shelby. Shelby will start off with a Swamp as land for turn, and then taps for 2 to cast a Do or Die targeting Cameron. The 2 piles are obviously Jaxis and Professional Facebreaker, and Cameron chooses to keep the Facebreaker around. After this, Shelby will pay 3 mana to Megamorph his Silumgar's Assassin up and kill Cameron's Facebreaker. It'll also get a +1/+1 counter. And when the Facebreaker dies, it'll be exiled with a hit counter. Shelby will then move to combat and swing both of his creatures at Cameron for 6 damage. Poor guy's getting bullied, but his start was so fast, so. But regardless, whenever they connect, Shelby gets to cash in on 2 hits, making 4 treasure tokens and drawing 2 cards. He'll then sacrifice 3 of those treasure tokens to cast a Doomed Necromancer, which is surprisingly mercenary. After this, the turn is passed to Sam, who starts off by tapping for 3 and casting Devilish Valet. He'll then tap for 6 mana and cast an Olivia Crimson Bride. Unfortunately, he has no creatures in the graveyard, but it is a flying haste creature. And when she enters Devilish Valet's power will double, and Sam will represent it with a dice. He'll then play Prismatic Vista as land for turn, fetch for a forest with it, and use that forest to pay for Gingerbrute's ability. Sam will then move to combat and swing Olivia and Gingerbrute at Shelby, and his commander and valet at Cameron. When they attack, he'll make 4 tap treasure tokens, and everyone will take their damage. The turn is then passed to Cameron, who is very excited about his draw. He'll then tap for 3 mana and cast a Dockside Extortionist, leaving 1 colorless floating. Let's just say the table's very glad that Shelby got rid of the Facebreaker, because those 2 go very well together. And when it and its ability resolves, Cameron will make 9 more treasure tokens, bringing him up to 11. Cameron will then pay 4 mana to blitz out Jaxis, but Chandler has a response. He'll pay 1 to channel Boseiju. He targets Illusionist Bracers, knowing that Cameron wants to make 2 copies of Dockside Extortionist with Jaxis this turn. The ability resolves, Bracers are destroyed, and Cameron gets a basic mount to the battlefield. Jaxis will then resolve, and Cameron activates her, pitching a mountain to make a copy of Dockside. Hey, he still gets 1, and makes 9 more treasures when it enters. Cameron will then activate War Room to draw a card and lose a life. He'll then pay 1 to sneak attack to put in a Clone Shell. When it enters the battlefield, he'll look at the top 4 cards of his library and imprint 1 under it, face down. Cameron will then move to end step, and he has 3 triggers. He'll let his Clone Shell and his Dockside copy resolve first. He'll draw a card off Blitz, and he'll get an Iron Mirror off of his Clone Shell. And when the shell dies, it is exiled with a hit counter. And finally, with Jaxis' trigger on the stack, Cameron will activate Sundial of the Infinite to end his turn. This means he gets to keep Jaxis, and the turn is now Chandler's, who starts off with a Bonder's Enclave as land for turn. He'll then tap for 4 mana and drop a Guardian Project. He'll then move to combat and swing his Facebreaker at Cameron and Goreclaw at Sam. And when Goreclaw attacks, all of Chandler's creatures with power 4 or greater get +1 and trample, and Goreclaw does affect herself. So Sam will take 5 damage and Cameron will take 2. And upon having 2 creatures connect with 2 players, Facebreaker will make Chandler 2 treasure tokens. Now in his second main, Chandler will count a total of 7 power and cast a 3 mana Galta thanks to Goreclaw's additional reduction of 2. And when Galta enters, Chandler will draw a card. And after this, the turn is passed to Shelby. And Shelby will start off by paying 4 mana and casting a Thran Dynamo. He'll then float 4 mana to play and then equip Prowler's Helm onto his commander. He'll then move to combat and swing Mary at Cameron, who can't block, and when she connects, Shelby will collect a hit, drawing a card and making 2 treasures. Now in second main, he'll sacrifice 3 treasures to cast Sanguine Spy, and then passes the turn to Sam. And he starts his turn off with an Urza's Saga. He'll then pay 3 mana to cycle a Ziatora's Proving Ground, then pays 7 to cast a Turntimber Symbiosis. He looks at the top 7 cards of his library and puts a Kiki Jiki into play, and this will trigger Devilish Valet. He'll then activate Kiki to make a copy of Gingerbrute, and this will trigger Devilish Valet again. Sam will then sacrifice his last treasure to give his original Gingerbrute unblockable, and then move to combat, swinging Olivia and the original Gingerbrute at Shelby, the copy Gingerbrute at Chandler, then Devilish Valet and Ognis at Cameron. Upon attacking, Sam will make 5 tap treasure tokens. Cameron will block Ognis with his Mirror, forgets to exile it when it dies, and then takes 4 damage. Chandler blocks the copy with Galta, and Shelby will take 4 damage. After this, the turn is passed to Cameron, who's getting a little desperate at his low life total, and decides to activate War Room to draw a card and lose a life. It's at this point Shelby reminds him that Mirror should be exiled with a hit counter, and so Cameron goes ahead and does that. He'll then play a basic mountain as land for turn, and then sneak attacks out a Feldon of the 3rd path. He'll then activate Jaxis, discarding a Fanatic of Mogis to make a copy of Feldon, and when it enters the battlefield, Legend Rule applies, and Cameron will sacrifice the copy with Blitz and draw a card. He'll then cast a 1000-year Elixir to try to do it again. He then taps the Elixir to untap Jaxis, then activates Jaxis, discarding a Mountain to make another copy of Feldon. Legend Rule and Blitz shenanigans, he draws another card. Then casts a Rings of Brighthearth, and then we'll move to his end step, and with the sneak attack trigger on the stack, he'll activate his Sundial to end the turn. Now on Chandler's turn, he immediately moves to combat. He'll swing Goreclaw and Facebreaker at Sam, and Galta at Shelby. Goreclaw will trigger to buff the already big creatures. Shelby blocks with a 2/3 that has Death Touch and Lifelink, and takes a total of 8, and Sam will just take 7. Chandler's creatures did combat damage to 2 players, so he'll make 2 treasures. And when Galta dies, he'll get exiled with a hit counter. He'll then move to his post-combat main phase, float 12 mana, and drop an Exsanguinate X's 10. This will drain all of his opponents for 10, and he'll gain life equal to the life lost this way, putting him at a very comfortable life total. Unfortunately, Cameron will die to this, and he does point out that he could technically end the game right here if he wanted to. If he activates Feldon on Fanatic of Mogis, and copies that ability with Rings of Brighthearth, it would do 14 total damage to all of his opponents, making Chandler win on the spot. Thankfully, he's a reasonable person and decides to not do that. And so the Exsanguinate resolves. Cameron will die, and Shelby and Sam are now at dangerous life totals. And now, Chandler will pass the turn. The turn is now Shelby's, and he'll start off with a basic Swamp. He'll then move to combat and swing his commander at Chandler. He'll collect the hit counter on Galta, drawing a card and making 2 treasures. He'll then immediately sack those 2 treasures, and tap for 9 more to drop his own Exsanguinate, X's 9. It'll resolve, Shelby will gain 18, and unfortunately that is exactly enough to kill Sam. So now our game is a 1v1. Shelby will then pass the turn to Chandler, who starts off with an Arbor Elf to draw a card off Guardian Project. He'll then tap for 6 to cast Ziatora, unfortunately forgetting about Goreclaw's cost reduction, but he will draw a card to Guardian Project when it enters. He'll then move to his end step and fling Arbor Elf at Shelby, making 3 treasures, and Arbor Elf is exiled with a hit counter. Now on Shelby's turn, he decides to start off with a Shieldred, the Whispering one. He'll then move to combat and swing his commander at Chandler, collecting the hit counter on Arbor Elf. He'll then suspend a Soul Talisman. After that, he'll cast a Dark Ritual, then float 1 more to cast Liliana of the Dark Realms. He'll immediately -3 her, which kills her, to give Ziatora -6/-6 till end of turn. Finally, he'll use his last 2 mana to cast Night's Whisper to draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. He'll then pass the turn to Chandler. Chandler sacrifices Facebreaker to Shieldred, and it gets exiled with a hit counter. He'll then play a Forest as land for turn, and then taps completely out, also sacrificing all of his treasures, to cast a Genesis Wave X's equal to 8. Unfortunately, it was a pretty mediocre Genesis Wave, though. The only reveals he gets to put onto the battlefield are a Bloodstained Mire, an Elemental Bond, a Mountain, and a Kenris transformation. He will put all of them onto the battlefield, and attach the Kenny T to Shieldred, and when it enters, he'll draw a card. The other 4 cards revealed this way are put into the graveyard. Now completely tapped out, Chandler will pass the turn. Now in his turn, Shelby will start off with a Plaguecrafter, making Chandler sacrifice his Goreclaw. When it dies, it'll be exiled with a hit counter, and Shelby will sacrifice his Phyrexian Praetor Elk. He'll then move to combat and swing his commander and his assassin at Chandler for 6 damage. When they connect, he'll collect 2 hits. He'll then sacrifice his Necromancer to bring Shieldred back. He'll then play an Una's Blackguard and then pass the turn to Chandler. Chandler will fetch with his Bloodstained Mire on end step, and Shelby responds by flashing in Opposition Agent. He controls Chandler's Search, looks through his deck for a little bit, and then exiles a basic Swamp. And since it is a rogue, it has a 1/1 counter. Now on Chandler's turn, he has a decent draw. He'll cast a Thragtusk. When it enters, he draws 2 and gains 5. After this, he'll shock in a Blood Crypt and then tap for 5 to cast a Moldervine Reclamation. He'll then just pass the turn to Shelby. And on his upkeep, Shieldred returns Sanguine Spy, and it'll enter with a 1/1 counter. Shelby will then play Chandler's Swamp as land for turn, and then he'll move to combat and swing everything but the creature he reanimated this turn. Chandler puts Thragtusk in front of the Opposition Agent, and before damage, Shelby will sacrifice it to his Sanguine Spy. He'll look at the top card of his library and put Big Game Hunter into the graveyard. Moving to damage, Chandler has to take 16 damage and will have to discard a card as well. The card discarded is a Valagad Recovery, and then Shelby will pass the turn. Now on Chandler's upkeep, he has to sacrifice Thragtusk, which is exiled with a counter. When it dies, he draws a card and gains a life, then makes a 3/3. When the 3/3 enters, he draws a card to Elemental Bond. He'll then play a Command Tower as land for turn, and then tap for 8 mana and drop a Meathook Massacre X is equal to 6. It'll resolve and completely wipe the board. Shelby has 6 creatures die, so Chandler will gain 6 life. Chandler has 1 creature die, so Shelby will lose 1 life, and then Moldervine Reclamation will let Chandler draw and gain. He'll then drop a Morbid Opportunist, and it entering the battlefield will draw him yet another card. The turn is now Shelby's, and on his upkeep, he gets to cast Soul Talisman. He'll then play a Swamp as land for turn. Then, wanting to go big or go home, Shelby will cast a Reanimate on Shieldred. It'll resolve and Shelby will lose 7 life. He'll then recast his commander and equip her with the helm. After this, he tasks her 3 and casts Royal Assassin, and then after rebuilding, he passes the turn. Chandler has to sacrifice his Morbid Opportunist on upkeep, but he'll draw and gain to his Moldavine Reclamation, and Shelby will lose 1 to Meathook Massacre. Then the Opportunist is exiled with a hit counter. Now in his first main, Chandler will play Castle locked away in his lane for turn. He then counts his mana and realizes he has a game-winning line. First off, he drops a Protein Hulk. When it enters, he draws 2 cards. He'll then cast a Ruthless Technomancer. When it enters the battlefield, he'll sacrifice his Protein Hulk to make 6 treasures. And when Protein Hulk dies, Chandler goes and searches for Lord of Extinction and Birds of Paradise from his library and puts them onto the battlefield. There are a lot of triggers after this. When the Protein Hulk dies, Shelby loses a life and Chandler will gain a life and draw a card. When the Technomancer enters, Chandler draws a card. Then, when Lord of Extinction and Birds of Paradise enter, Chandler will draw 3 more cards. Finally, with 2 lands left untapped and 6 treasures, Chandler will cast his commander, Ziatora, move to his end step, and fling a Lord of Extinction at Shelby. Chandler has 13 cards in his graveyard, and Shelby has 14, so this is more than enough to kill him. So, there you have it. Chandler wins this week with Ziatora. Well everybody, there you have it. That was a super interesting game. Everybody got to do a lot. Cameron's deck exploded really early, and Sam got to do a lot once he was generating treasures every turn. Shelby's deck was almost like a mono-black control list. It actually surprised me the most. And Ziatora, while it was a little slow, got to do a lot once it got a lot of mana. But what matters most is what you guys thought. Let us know down in the comments below. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. While you're down there, don't forget to check out our deck lists and our social media pages as well. And if you're interested, we've got a public Discord page now where we do weekly community games. Thank you guys so much again for watching. I hope you all have a smooth day.